Our group was presented with the question of how can space and design be used to construct a meaningful and appropriate narrative about the Nanjing Massacre. To aid us in answering the driving question, our whole innovation group visited the Nanjing Memorial. When we visited the museum, it was obvious that there was a lot of propaganda scattered across it, and we came to learn that the Nanjing Massacre is an important part of the patriotic education campaign and emphasizes on China as a victim in order for the CCP to ensure its legitimacy. Even the architect of the Nanjing Memorial admitted that the museum focuses on anger and hatred.
This disturbed our team greatly after learning much of the history of that time period, largely that the Chinese government essentially pulled the troops out of Nanjing due to the fact that it was not possible for them to do much anymore. The blame cannot be put all on the government during this time period, even though they could have attempted to defend Nanjing from their attackers. But blaming them is not the point of the memorial or remembering the event. The point is that the government should not take credit or make an event that wasn't originally about them. That's why we chose to redesign our whole museum.
In the new design, we felt it was more suitable to focus back in on the families that were affected by the massacre. One of our motifs is the ripple effect, and we chose to use this as it relates directly on the narrative we are trying to tell. We want to evaluate and show visually the effect of this catastrophe onto generations and generations of families, which is specifically why we chose to incorporate the rings into our design, and why our design of the interior has been turned into a maze.
We chose to highlight the familial experiences in our museum as we felt that they were largely ignored in the original one. Although these experiences were addressed, they were not addressed to the full extent of the emotional pain that the families went through. In our museum, the rings show a progression of time. As the rings expand in the interior, the progression of time is shown through highlighting the experiences of different generations of survivors. Our final room is modeled after a lighthouse. It is placed above the whole maze, so once museum goers are done viewing the displays, they can come into this room and see all the history they have just explored and reflect on the experiences of all these generations of survivors.
This relates to our group experience of reading Man's Search for Meaning. Human beings are extremely resilient, but the effect of their experiences, particularly bad ones, are palpable when examining their families. This scene in the book, Mouse, where Art and his father struggled with connecting due to the trauma that his father had experienced from his time during the Holocaust. And this came into effect Art greatly too, as he experienced anxiety and depression later on in his life. We believe that by allowing museum goers to reflect, the anger that the Chinese population have harbored for the Japanese will be channeled towards forgiveness. We firmly believe that by addressing those who were directly affected, we can address the human ability to endure horrible experiences and get past it. The next chapter will be achieving closure about this event.
As we've mentioned before, one of our motifs is the ripple effect. Another one is the use of geometric shapes. The use of geometric shapes outlines this part of history as extremely sharp, harsh, and gashy. We infused it into our museum in order to show the stereotypical viewing of this part of history. It also represents the tension between the Chinese and the Japanese and how they have bad blood between them. It simultaneously serves as a visual example of the Japanese cruelty throughout the Nanjing Massacre and the blatant disregard for human life and human rights.
It is present throughout the facade of the exterior and across the floor and displays in our interior. The use of geometric shapes directly contrasts with another one of our motifs, grayscale. We chose to infuse this exclusively in our interior. As you can see, it is an ombre from black to a lighter gray to show the progression of history and how the different generations deal with the event. Although it is obvious that it is still serious in the Chinese people's hearts, today we feel that as the generations pass, slowly closure will be achieved, and slowly the Japanese will learn to accept that this event actually happened, which is also a goal of our museum narrative.
We felt that this would suit the people of China better in the way that it doesn't serve to glorify the Japanese or downplay the events and the experiences of the Chinese people, but rather tries to offer a more objective viewing that would focus on the more emotional aspects of the event. The goal, after all, is to forgive, but never forget. And another key feature about our narrative would be to tell the story without using any adjectives and strive to be as objective as possible in its telling. We believe that the story speaks for itself in the horrors that were committed against the Chinese, and that by focusing on the families and being objective and fair to both sides about this massacre, we can provide closure for the Chinese and finally acceptance of the event from the Japanese. We realize all these goals are extremely ambitious, but we firmly stand behind the idea that this is what the memorial should strive for. Whether or not it actually achieves the goal is another matter. The thought behind it needs to be there. We will now give you a full tour of our redesigned museum.
As you can see from our explanations behind the visual elements in the museum, we constantly keep the historical background and human experiences in mind. Another element that we prioritized was how energy efficient our building was going to be. When we view COP21 standards and the various scientific journals being published, we can all quickly realize that global warming is one of the most prevalent problems of the modern world. One of the reasons for global warming is the ever-increasing carbon footprint of the human race. One of the ways by which we can reduce the carbon footprint is to make the building more energy efficient, to reduce the amount of energy expended in the heating and cooling of buildings. All buildings, and ours included, should strive to lessen this problem by being extremely selective about the materials being used rather than simply going for aesthetics.
This is precisely what our group has chosen to do. We decided to make our building out of concrete as it is one of the most common building materials and has a good structural integrity, and have the more aesthetically pleasing glass facade simply go over it. The R value of a material is a measure of its thermal resistance. The higher the R value, the more effective the material would be as an insulator. The problem with concrete is that it has a very low R value, and thus will easily allow energy leakage. One of the ways by which we reduce the energy leakage of the building is the insulation found within it. Keeping the R value as well as environmental impact in mind, we decided to use cellulose as the insulator for the building.
The thermal performance of cellulose compares favorably to other types of low-cost insulation, and it leaves few air pockets that can reduce the overall efficiency of the building. This is just one example of how we have incorporated the COP21 standards and lowered energy leakage in our building. Thermal energy transfer can happen in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is the transfer of thermal energy by the collision of atoms or molecules. Convection is the transfer of thermal energy by the movement or circulation of either a liquid or a gas from a zone of higher thermal energy to lower thermal energy. Radiation is another form of thermal energy transfer, where the energy is transferred in rays, waves, or particles. All forms of energy leakage must be kept in mind due to the fact that this museum is being built in Nanjing, where the weather varies greatly between seasons. As we've already mentioned, our glass is present to visually represent our motif, and the differentiation in the color of glass is meant to show the varying degrees of history and how differences will always be present in different interpretations of history.
The idea behind the pond surrounding the exterior is derived from our motif, the ripple effect. We've incorporated rings from the interior to the exterior by having a machine constantly pound the surface of the water to create a ripple. As we go from looking at the pond to looking at the door, you may notice that the handles for the doors are typically on the interior. We've purposely chosen to do this to rebel against the status quo, much like how our museum narrative has. Now onto the interior. The geometric tiles on the floor directs the audience's path through the maze. This is done through the tile perimeters, which emit light. We've also included sections where you can deviate from the path and explore the more unpleasant aspects of history, such as the violence committed by the Japanese. We believe that this information is not imperative to the narrative, yet is worth mentioning to allow the audience to fully understand the experience of the Chinese.
All of these specific elements and structures across the museum serve as an example of how we have been thoughtful and aware in our design for this project. We believe that through using the design motifs of geometric shapes, the ripple effect, and grayscale, we have communicated our narrative of focusing on how families were affected by this event and work in achieving our goal of providing closure for the Chinese and acceptance of the event from the Japanese.